Today we'll be covering the agenda. Basically what we'd like to do is present you our annual report of 1213, and this will be done by our chair of the board of directors and our CEO of PPP Canada. So we'll start with Mr. Tony Comper, the chair of PPP Canada. Mr. Comper joined the board of directors when we started operations in 2009, and we are very happy and pleased that he was appointed our chair of the board this year in 2013. Mr. Comper is the former president and CEO of BMO Financial Group. He served as a director of Spectra Energy Corporation, is a member of the International Advisory Committee of Lika Shing Knowledge Institute of St. Michael Hospital, as well as honorary chair of the Board of Governors of the EON Centre for Geriatric Care and the advisory board of the Conference Board of Canada. Mr. Comper has degrees from Mount St. Vincent University, the University of New Brunswick, and Haifa University, and an honorary law degree from the University of Toronto. Following Mr. Comper's presentation, Mr. John McBride, our CEO, will discuss PPP Canada's role in advancing government policy, our position as a centre of expertise for P3 within the federal government, and review the state of the Canadian P3 market. Mr. McBride was appointed the first CEO of PPP Canada back in 2009. He has experience working with both the public and the private sectors in infrastructure development and finance. He has previously held positions in industry, senior positions in Industry Canada, the CEO, president of the Canadian Commercial Corporation, and many positions at the senior level of finance and treasury board. Following the both presentation, we will have a question period, and we'll invite people in the room, and also we are taking questions from the people online. So we'll be answering those questions. Sans plus tarder, j'aimerais vous inviter à écouter notre président du conseil d'administration, M. Tony Comper.
Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Avec mes collègues de 3P Canada, je suis très content d'avoir l'occasion de discuter avec vous les projets de 2012-2013. It's been a very eventful year, and we're very pleased. I was going to start off by talking a little bit about, so why does P3 Canada exist, and where did it come from? And you should know, and I think most of the people in this room and on the webcast do know, that this organization was in fact the brainchild of the federal government, and in particular the Minister of Finance, Mr. Flaherty, who saw great advantage in improving the procurement process for public infrastructure by helping provinces, municipalities, and the federal government departments with going through a P3 process. And why do this? Well, I think I'm kind of preaching to the converted in this room that the P3 process is a significant way of transferring risk from the public sector to the private sector, and therefore giving assurance to the public sector that projects that are focused on public infrastructure in fact will come in on time, on budget, and if there are any significant difficulties, the risk will be for the account of the private sector entities that bid and agree to both fixed time schedules and fixed costs. So that's kind of the rationale for doing it. But in fact, Minister Flaherty put out a press release this morning talking about one of our specific projects, one in Regina, and I would draw your attention to that because he's done a much better job than I will be able to do explaining the rationale as to why P3s are an important component of funding and managing public infrastructure, both the procurement process, but the ongoing financing, designing, building, operating, and maintaining. So let me just turn to the slides that we have here. And I'm not going to read through the slides because I think the materials have been made available to everyone here. But just before I start, I'd also like to draw your attention to those with us who are on our board of directors. And I'll start and I'll ask each of the directors, when I call their name, to just stand up and wave, starting with Jacques Lemar, who is the chair of our investment committee, Carol Pennycook, Rick Byers, and Bill McMacken. And who couldn't be with us in person today but is on the webcast is Peter Armstrong from Vancouver. So that completes our initial phase. Let me now go to the next slide. And this talks a little bit about public-private partnerships and a little bit more detail of what I explained is the role of the public-private partnerships and why we're doing it. And on the next slide, you can see that they're value-driven arrangements, and there's both the two main elements, which is cost savings, which includes risk transfer, efficiency, and innovation, and also fiscal planning certainty. And from the public service point of view, that's arguably one of the most important aspects of the P3, which is it provides accountability, it assures on time, on budget delivery, and it focuses on outcomes, with the risk being borne by the private sector entities that are involved in the P3s. You can see on the next slide that our corporate mandate, and that's for P3 Canada, we have a mission to, it says here, to deliver the public infrastructure by achieving better value, timeliness, and accountability through P3s. And the mandate that, in fact, the Minister of Finance has given us is to expand the utilization of P3s across the spectrum of all the provinces, because not all the provinces are as heavily invested as, say, for example, Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec might be. And so to expand that, because there is an abiding belief among the federal government that taking this approach for public infrastructure projects at both the provincial level, the federal government level, and the municipal level is a much more effective way of doing procurement of public infrastructure. And so that's our mandate. And there's also an education mandate as part of this, which is we are educating the various users of the P3 concept across the country as to what the elements are. I should add that doing a project as a P3 initially is quite a complex process, and it's got very specific elements to it, all designed to lead to facilitating orderly development of the project. And so we're in the business as well of helping all of those clients, whether they be at the provincial, the municipal level, or the federal government level, going through that process. Those who have already been exposed to it are well aware of what the elements are, but not everyone is. And so we have an education mission as well as a delivery mission. On the next slide, you can see that our objectives are to build and leverage our expertise, P3 Canada's expertise, to provide P3 leadership across Canada, to broaden P3 Canada's engagement on capital projects at the federal level, and to develop public sector capacity. Now, to help us do that, in fact, the federal government has given us a fund of about $1.6 billion, which has recently been renewed with the budget, by the way. And we use that fund to co-participate with our clients in the development of P3s. We will participate up to 25% of a project, depending on that. Now, I should add at the outset that not all potential projects will qualify as a P3 project, and there's some very specific criteria. And so we go through a very elaborate screening process, and we have several rounds of investment that I'll talk about in a moment. On the next slide, you can see that, this is our board of directors. As I said, Bill McMacken, who's chair of the audit committee, and Jacques Lemar, who's chair of the investment committee. And there are other directors, but those are the main components of the board governance structure. If I can turn to the next slide, you'll see that we also have significant expert specializations within the organization of P3 Canada, and they're detailed on that chart. On the next slide, we talk about, there's a nice picture of our board of directors, and we go through the process. A lot of expertise within our board of directors. Many of the directors have been involved in different capacities in developing P3s, and that's very, very helpful because they have a lot of knowledge of what makes a good P3 and what doesn't make a good P3. On the next slide, you can see that I'm going now to talk about a little bit of the highlights in 2012 and 2013. of the different committees. The Audit Committee highlights, of course, the principal role and responsibility of the Audit Committee under the very capable direction of Bill McMacken is reviewing the financials and the financial statements and making sure that everything is in order. I should add, and I'll come to a wind-up slide at the very end, but we take great pride in the fact that in our 5 years of existence, we have received squeaky clean audit sign-off by our external auditors and the Office of the Attorney General on all of our financials for 5 years in a row, and that's a credit to Bill's leadership in the Audit Committee in terms of what we're doing. The next committee is the Governance and Human Resources Committee. I chair that. And we go through every year looking at our board charters, our committee charters, and making sure that they're consistent with what the federal government would regard as best practices in each one of those areas. We also do every year, and we will be doing again this year, a self-evaluation of the board. And that looks at the board process. It also looks at individual directors, and each of the directors is able to do this in confidence, and we have an outside firm that helps us assess how we're doing and are we doing a good job and what are areas of improvement, if any. So we do that every year. Also very importantly, and this is the role of any board, which is we look at the succession plan for our CEO, but also for members of senior management, and that's an important role and responsibility for the board, as I'm sure everyone in the room and on the webcast understands. One of the things that we did this year, though, was we looked very carefully at the short-term disability and sick leave benefits for the members of our staff, and we modified those to bring them more into line with the private sector. And this is something that the federal government is doing across all departments as we speak, but we took an early role in terms of doing that, which was, in fact, well received by the members of our staff. On the next slide, you can see that the Investment Committee, under the capable direction of Jacques Lamar, approved the launch of rounds 4 and 5 of the P3 Canada Fund. A little bit of a digression. The way in which we manage the fund is we'll have a round of receiving applications. We've already done round 1 and round 2, and then we close it at a certain point in time, and we look at the individual applications, and then we take them through the process of determining whether they qualify as legitimate P3s, and if so, what the value for money analysis is, and do they make sense economically and logistically and from a project management point of view. So in 2012 and 2013, we formally closed rounds 2 and 3, and we recommended the P3 Canada Fund investments for rounds 3 and 4. You'll see those in a moment. On the next slide, you can see that, and this is what I was talking about, the report of the independent auditor, and this is 5 years in a row now that our financials have been audited both by an outside firm, KPMG, and also by the Auditor General, who simultaneously look at our financial results and our financial reports and make sure that everything is clean, and it is. On the next slide, you can see that this is our financial position. I won't comment too much on this. There's one item there, which is in the 2012-2013, the second line there, you can see that there's $400,000. What that's all about is the federal government, relatively recently, within the last year, approved the mandate of P3 Canada to provide consulting services to federal government departments to help them understand the mechanics of doing a P3 and assessing the business cases and looking at those. And so that $400,000 are internal fees that we have received from federal government departments to do that work on their behalf. On the next slide, you can see that this is the 2012-2013 list of projects and the commitments from the P3 Canada Fund over a period of time. I won't go into detail on all of those. You have it in the materials that have been handed out to you, and if you have any questions on that, we'd be pleased to answer them. Next, you can see that we have a commitment to corporate excellence. We want to be a leader in human resources management, and we want to make sure that we're having effective corporate and business processes and enhance corporate performance management. So, all by way of saying on the next slide, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. I'm now going to introduce or reintroduce our CEO, John McBride, who's going to talk a little bit about what we did in 2012-2013. And at that point in time, we'll be prepared to open it up for questions. So thank you very much. John?
Merci, Tony. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous aujourd'hui. Merci beaucoup pour avoir pris le temps d'être avec nous, d'engager avec nous, d'apprendre un peu ce que nous faisons. Et j'espère poser des questions sur nos accomplissements puis nos engagements pour le futur. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais remercier Tony pour sa présentation et souligner beaucoup la valeur ajoutée de notre conseil d'administration. Nous sommes très chanceux, comme une corporation, d'avoir un conseil d'administration si expérimenté qui nous donne beaucoup de conseils stratégiques et pour moi-même, de me rendre imputable pour les opérations de coopération. I'm going to highlight a bit about what Tony has already covered and dig into a little bit more detail. I'm going to talk a bit about who we are, how we're organized, what we're about. Dig in a bit more about why P3s. Tony's kind of given you a amuse-bouche of sort of P3s, but I want to talk a bit more. Underscore a bit from a different perspective than Tony has about why PPP Canada and what we're really trying to achieve, and then dig into some of the accomplishments on each of our strategic objectives. Next slide. What do we do? I mean, fundamental to what we do is to act as a source of expertise. Underpinning everything we do is expertise, and we'll talk a bit more about that in detail, but as Tony's highlighted, P3s are a different way of doing business. A different way of doing business that requires a different sort of expertise in industry, but most importantly in the public sector. I had the opportunity a little over a year ago to meet Gordon Campbell, who's now our High Commissioner in London. And while he was Premier of BC, he started Partnerships BC, and I asked him, well, what really prompted you to start Partnerships BC? And he said, well, P3s are a commercial transaction, and on the public sector side, I wanted people with expertise in commercial transactions so that, I know that I'm getting a good deal. And, I think that really sums it up, that you need expertise on both sides of the table to make P3s work, and that's what we're about. But expertise, we're not an academic organization. We're not an organization that's just about putting expertise into reports to put them on the shelves. It's really about, are we achieving more P3s that deliver value to taxpayers in the country? And that's why we try to deploy our expertise to help the federal government to apply P3 and P3 concepts to its capital projects. And we work very closely with provinces and municipalities across the country to help them do that as well. Next slide. In that context, we have a great opportunity to introduce this morning the management team, and thank you, Carol. Nobody introduced you, but who also is a critical member of our management team. So we divide ourselves up around the process for P3s, basically. So Carol Beaulieu helps people with project development. What does that mean? That means helping people to identify potential P3 opportunities, taking them and developing them into robust business cases, and preparing them for final investment decisions. So, do you have a P3 opportunity? Is it the right one? Have you optimized it? And is this ready to go forward? And he works hand in hand with Michael, who takes that, says, okay, well, is it a really good P3? We have our own internal challenge processes to make sure that we ask each other the hard questions, and then takes people from that investment decision right through to financial close, right through the procurement process. We work with our clients. The job isn't sort of, hey, you've got a good idea. Our job is to help people realize those good ideas in terms of value to taxpayers. Greg steps in and says, okay, you've got to financially close. The job's not done until you're at substantial completion and you've actually got a project built. And he helps to get people through to substantial completion, the finances, and also make sure that we are a well-run organization and stewardship. And Carol's the glue that holds us all together in terms of strategy and people. Next slide. Pourquoi les PPP? Tony a bien souligné quelques aspects d'une PPP qui donnent une valeur ajoutée. Moi, j'aimerais souligner deux choses pour moi deux autres choses qui, pour moi, sont très importantes. Surtout, j'aimerais souligner encore que ce n'est pas les PPP qui sont notre objectif. Notre objectif, c'est la valeur ajoutée pour les contribuables. Ce n'est pas qu'une PPP est le meilleur outil tout le temps, mais quand c'est le meilleur outil, est-ce qu'on peut l'appliquer d'une façon efficace? Une PPP, surtout, donne un aperçu global, ça optimise et intègre tout le cycle de vie d'un bien. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Dans un mode traditionnel, la conception d'un projet est une partie, puis la construction, puis l'exploitation, puis l'entretien. Dans une PPP, tous ces volets sont intégrés dans une proposition. Ça ajoute deux choses. On peut optimiser le coût d'un projet. Comment? Alors, parce que les personnes dans une PPP, les personnes qui font la conception, ont une imputabilité pour la construction. C'est les mêmes personnes. Et les personnes qui construisent les projets ont l'imputabilité de faire l'entretien puis l'exploitation. Alors, est-ce que c'est mieux de faire X ou Y dans la conception? Alors, ça intègre tous les risques et tous les coûts d'un projet dans un seul contrat. Et aussi, ça évite des risques. Souvent, dans un projet, la personne qui fait la construction dit « Ah, c'est pas ma faute. C'est la personne qui a fait la conception. » Ou la personne dans l'exploitation dit « C'est pas ma faute. C'est la faute de la personne qui a construit le projet. » Si la personne a construit le projet d'une façon différente, il y aura moins de difficultés avec l'exploitation. Quand on le fait dans un contrat, il n'y a aucune façon de faire c'est lui, c'est toi qui as fait tout ça. C'est dans un contrat. Aussi, pour moi, une grande partie de l'autre volet d'une PPP, c'est le rôle de la finance privée. On parle de transfert de risque. Mais quand le secteur privé met leur argent à risque, ça aligne des initiatives. Ça veut dire quoi? Il n'y a tout le monde est aligné dans la même direction. Ça renforce la supervision. Ça veut dire quoi? Si tu as la responsabilité d'emprunter 500 millions de dollars, les personnes qui vous empruntent l'argent exercent une supervision que le secteur public ne peut pas. Il n'y a aucune façon pour le secteur public de faire le même niveau de supervision. Et ça discipline le rendement. Ça donne une discipline au projet parce que l'argent est à risque. Alors, souvent on entend, les gouvernements peuvent emprunter d'argent à un taux d'intérêt plus bas. Mais d'une partie, ça c'est une partie vraie, mais ça ne donne pas tout l'aperçu de la situation parce que la discipline de finances privées, c'est vraiment le transfert de risque, ça ajoute beaucoup de valeur. Et c'est pas que les projets n'ont pas des risques. Alors, quand on met l'argent du secteur privé, ça rend les risques d'un projet plus ouverts et plus disciplinés. Next slide. Et c'est ça qu'avec un processus de toute une vie de bien, plus les disciplines de capital à risque, ça ajoute beaucoup de choses. Retour de biens. À la fin le contrat, il y a de l'argent à risque encore. Alors, si le secteur privé ne retourne pas le bien d'une façon appropriée, leur argent est à risque. Livraison à temps et budget. Le secteur privé ne reçoit pas d'argent jusqu'à le point que le projet est fini. Ça donne un encouragement de faire quelque chose d'un temps à l'heure. Transfert de risque, on parle beaucoup de transfert de risque, mais quand l'argent du secteur privé est à risque, et il y a beaucoup d'argent à risque, c'est ça qu'on a vraiment un transfert à risque. Minimisation du coût d'un cycle de vie. Parce que le secteur privé prend la responsabilité jusqu'au début, jusqu'à la fin du projet, eux ont la responsabilité d'optimiser les coûts. Et il y a toute une histoire, de chaque projet, une histoire comment il le fait. Des petites choses, des grandes choses, des innovations du secteur privé. Quand on peut avoir accès à toute cette innovation dans un seul contrat, c'est incroyable les résultats qu'on peut recevoir. Responsabilité. Responsabilité, oui, il y a un contrat, mais il y a d'argent à risque. Alors, eux, ils sont imputables, et c'est imputable avec leur argent, pas l'argent du gouvernement. Certitude de planification, Tony a souligné ça. Quand on signe un contrat PPP, on sait exactement les coûts pendant tous les 30 ans ou 25 ans du projet. Ils sont visibles, ce n'est pas juste les coûts de conception qu'on voit, ce n'est pas juste les coûts de construction, ce n'est pas juste les coûts d'exploitation. On voit tous les coûts pour 30 ans. Ils sont visibles. Et ça donne aux politiciens, aux fonctionnaires, une certitude de les coûts pour les prochaines 30 ans. Et dans un contexte fiscal, avec toutes les difficultés, d'avoir cette certitude d'une planification fiscale est un atout, un grand atout pour des PPP. On a parlé déjà de la discipline et aussi l'innovation. Mais c'est vrai que les PPP viennent avec des avantages puis des inconvénients. Alors, c'est notre travail d'analyser des projets et en fait une analyse profonde. Est-ce que ces projets vaut un mode de livraison PPP? Ce n'est pas tous les projets qui vaut un mode de livraison PPP. C'est plutôt des projets qui sont plus larges, les projets qui sont plus complexes, et surtout des projets avec plus de risques, parce que c'est dans ce contexte qu'on reçoit une valeur ajoutée. Next slide. Why PPP Canada? Tony highlighted, the perspective of the government, but I just want to give you an international perspective on this. I talked about specialized skills, and it is really that. And we get delegations internationally. We talk to our provincial colleagues, and one of the things that Canada is a leader at, and why it's been so successful in PPPs, is it's recognized that people will undertake PPPs irregularly. They don't happen in every department every year. So to build a set of skills to undertake these projects in a fragmented kind of way has not been a successful model. So you do need a set of specialized skills that are constantly in the market, constantly working at PPPs, and that's what we are. And, why is this important for the federal government? People forget that the federal government is a major builder of infrastructure itself. The Department of Defense, Public Works. The Government of Canada is the biggest real estate and accommodation owner in the country. You know, people lose track of the scale of the capital infrastructure that the federal government is involved in, and it also wants to realize the benefits of P3 delivery. But that is not the only role of the federal government. The federal government provides billions of dollars to other levels of government for the development of public infrastructure. And as the Minister of Finance, wants to make sure that they're getting the best value for those dollars that provinces and municipalities are spending. So it's all about value for money. Next slide. I mentioned international practice, and some people sort of talk about the UK and sort of other kinds of things. It's interesting, you know, international examples. I'm reading in the quote there. In countries such as Canada, were held up as examples that the UK should follow. So it's one of the strengths and one of the weaknesses that the UK are things that we have learned, and it's not just PPP Canada, it's Infrastructure Ontario and Partnerships BC, and we have close relationships with those. But expertise and bringing that together in one place is really our raison d'etre. Next slide. Source of expertise. All right? You know, if we're known about anything, I hope that we're an organization that's known as a place to come if you want to hear about the best practices domestically and internationally about P3s. And how have we done that? Well, the number one thing is we've built a great team, right? Many of the people in this room, the ones with these little gold tags, are experts in P3s. And we have drawn from many different disciplines from across the country. We've drawn from provincial agencies, we've drawn from municipalities, we've drawn from the private sector, and we have consciously built that team over the last 5 years, and we invest a lot in training and developing. But the best way to train our people is getting them exposed to real life projects. And we've invested now almost $4 billion in P3 projects, and we've not invested in even more, right? We have learned the good and the bad and through the process, and we are regularly engaged with the key industry players, and we are regularly engaged with the top public sector procurers in this country and internationally, because this is a business that's constantly evolving. The structure of P3s 5 years ago are different than the structure of P3s now. And keeping constantly abreast about that evolution of market practices is essential for our business. I talked about training development. We invest a lot, you know. As I say to some of my federal colleagues, I think we're the only organization where financial modeling is mandatory training for every employee in the organization, right? So we are in the business of analytical tools and analysis of P3s, which is unique and something that we're very proud of. But we have learned from others, a lot of learning from others. So we are in constant contact with the leading procurement, and, you know, huge credit to people, you know, in Infrastructure Ontario, Partnerships BC, who are there before us, and we've been able to work with all of those organizations over the last 4 years to understand their best practice and distill them into the best of the best practices. And we are constantly in contact with industry who come and share their ideas with us. Next slide. You know, our goal is not just to create the expertise. We call it knowledge development and sharing. I mean, expertise that sort of resides or sits on a shelf is not our goal. Our goal is to be able to share it. So we reach out to people. We share our expertise in we develop tools, and you can find these on our website, tools about how do you figure out whether a project should be a P3, what should you do in terms of a business case, putting together the kind of tools that people need in order to understand how to best do P3s, and we're constantly engaging people on that issue. Next slide. Very complicated slide, this. The point being that over the last 5 years, our engagement and our ability to be a source of expertise. We have gone from being in the position of learning to being in a position of sharing to, I think we're now emerging as sort of, national and international leaders in terms of expertise. And we've done that through our own internal investments, but we've done that through practical experience in projects over the last 5 years. Next slide. And this knowledge, we're working hard to put it into usable pieces. Highlight a couple of them. We issued this year a water and wastewater study. This wasn't our study. I mean, it was. I mean, we stand behind everything that's in it. But this was a study that was prepared and was done in consultation with the engagement of both public sector people that have actually done water and wastewater to learn from their best examples, and was engaged with the industry. So both industry and the public sector procurers, both sides, sat and reviewed and provided comments and put this into what can be a best practices guide for people to use. We are helping people with our own tools about, if you're a municipality, what are the things to think about? If you're, you want to put together a business case, what is the best practices way of doing these kinds of business cases? And these are tools that people can use, and these are tools that we use ourselves in working with clients. And we have plans for more. Right. Next slide. We're looking at other sectors that we're focused on. So energy from waste should come out this year, following the same kind of process of engaging with both public and private sectors. Bridges and tolling studies. As you can see, the areas that we focus on in terms of expertise are not abstract. These are actually directly related to the projects that we're working on, and so that there is a direct application for that. We're increasingly engaged with federal departments on identifying P3s. We're increasingly engaged with federal departments on doing business cases. I'm going to talk more about this, but the big thing moving forward would be to go from, we very much have worked hard with federal departments on identifying and building business cases, but we really think there's a value-added opportunity to help federal departments in the execution of their projects, and we've been doing a lot of investment in trying to build the knowledge capital on the procurement phase of federal projects. Next slide. Comme j'ai dit, notre expertise c'est pas un objectif. Notre expertise c'est l'application de notre expertise en la réalisation des projets. Et un de nos mandats, c'est d'aider les ministères fédéraux en identification, développement, puis la réalisation des projets. Et pendant les derniers 18 mois, on a changé beaucoup notre focus pour rebalancer nos priorités entre les autres niveaux de gouvernement puis le gouvernement fédéral. Alors, tout d'abord, ça veut dire la sensibilisation du ministère fédéral en P3. C'est un travail d'éducation. Tony a souligné le rôle de coopération dans l'éducation des personnes. Il y a beaucoup de mythes sur les P3. Alors, éduquer les gens, c'est quoi vraiment un P3? C'est quoi un P3? Est-ce qu'il y a une application pour un P3 dans leur contexte? On fait beaucoup de travail dedans. Prochain citat. Identification. Dans le budget 2011, le gouvernement a établi une politique qui dit que chaque projet capital au-dessus de 100 millions devrait être revu pour la possibilité d'exploitation en mode P3. Alors, on travaille étroitement avec les ministères qui ont des grands projets capitaux pour revoir si le projet peut être viable comme une P3. Ça nous engage surtout avec des ministères, avec des une grande partie capitale, avec un budget capital important. Comme le assistant a dit, on a déjà fait une quinzaine de revues comme ça. Prochaine assistante. Mais ce n'est pas juste l'identification. Notre travail avec les ministères fédéraux n'arrête pas jusqu'à l'identification. Est-ce que c'est viable? En disant que c'est viable, ça ne dit pas qu'un projet devrait ou être une pétoire. Il faut faire une analyse plus profonde pour vraiment analyser si les coûts, les avantages, les inconvénients dit qu'une P3 c'est le meilleur mode de livraison. Alors, on travaille beaucoup avec des ministères en développant des business cases. Et comme l'assistant a dit au troisième volet, on travaille avec plusieurs ministères actuellement en réalisation des business cases. Prochaine assistante. Puis on donne beaucoup de services, on parle de présélectionnement, mais on a beaucoup de services à offrir aux ministères fédéraux. Et on fait beaucoup de travail avec eux. Et comme Tony a mentionné, on met une discipline à nous. Si nos conseils donnent une valeur ajoutée, on reçoit des revenus pour. Alors, c'est pour une discipline pour nous et une discipline pour eux. Si notre conseil vaut quelque chose, il faut payer pour notre conseil. Et on reçoit jamais aucune difficulté avec ça parce que je suis très heureux de dire que des ministères, des agences voient une valeur ajoutée à nos conseils. Prochaine assistante. While we've focused a lot more on the federal side, I don't want to give the impression that means we're focusing less on our work with other levels of government. As a staff would tell you, it's not about we're doing less. We're just doing more everywhere, right? And so we continue to work very closely with other levels of government, primarily through the P3 Canada Fund. We have now done we contributed we made financial commitments of almost $400 million in 12-13 alone, bringing our total to almost $800 million, which is, somewhere $3.5 billion worth of projects. And I'm not sure you can see, but all those little dots are the places where we've done projects. And we've done them with municipalities, we've done them with provinces, we've done them in the north, we've done them in different sectors. So we are really spreading our wings on where we're working with provinces and municipalities. Next slide. The fund works. We call annually for applications. Tony mentions round 2, 3, 4. Those are our annual investment rounds. We don't just sit back and wait for applications to arrive. We're very proactive in working with provinces and municipalities. I think primarily the provinces in the top 25 municipalities, because tend to be the larger projects that are suitable for P3. We've focused very much on core public infrastructure requirements, transportation, water and wastewater, and solid waste disposal. In tight fiscal circumstances, it makes sense to focus on what's the sort of core needs. And we have always focused on what provides the optimal value, but we give priority to projects that provide full, design, build, finance, operate, maintain, all elements of private sector involvement. We do that because, in general, we believe that, the more you can put in terms of full accountability across DBFOM, the better value you can get. And we, as the P3 Canada Fund, are looking for the very best in P3s. So It's not to sort of say that other models don't make sense, but we're looking very much for the full-scale P3s. Next slide. We recognize that P3s are new for people. We recognize, and we've talked a lot about this, that it requires a new type of expertise. It requires a different type of thought process. This business case that we keep talking about. It's a different type of analytical model that gets you to the decision on a P3. We would argue, and I think this is proven in fact, that disciplined analytical process that takes you through risks, that forces you through cost, that is the kind of analytical process that should be taken for every large project, irrespective of the delivery mode, but it often isn't. I say that because I think there's value. To go through the business case process delivers value even if the business case concludes that P3 isn't the right model. And we can show you examples of that people have thought about things that they hadn't thought about if they hadn't gone through that discipline. But that requires upfront costs. It does take, it's always peculiar that someone's willing to spend, $400 million on a project, but not $400,000 into figuring out how they should go about it. But that's a new type of discipline on people to do that upfront investment. That planning and thought process delivers benefits. In order to help people with that, we have what we call the Project Development Fund, which allows us to share up to 50% of the costs with clients of doing that upfront thinking. And that is particularly helpful for municipalities that are brand new in this game, who are not used to having to do that kind of process. Next slide. Some of the specifics of some of the projects that we have done, I'll pick on a few just to kind of talk about what we're doing in terms of expanding the market. The East Side Housing Renewal Project. What is that? Sounds like people building houses. This is single residency occupant for, frankly, homeless people. And if anyone who's been to East Side Vancouver and has seen those 100-year hotels that are in all sorts of state of disrepair, this was a bundle of 13 of those things to provide social housing to some of the most destitute people in the country. And it was new. BC has been in the business of doing P3s, but they've been primarily doing them in healthcare and in justice and transportation. They'd never done one in social housing. So this was new in the country. And it was the first time they'd had one which was a significant rehabilitation. So, we both learned about how can you apply this in social housing, but we also learned about to what extent can you do rehabilitation in the context of a P3. Why is that complicated? Well, the private sector is going to take on the risk, and they're going to take on the risk of renovating and delivering these buildings for 30 years. Social housing clients are a different type of client, that no one had ever had that experience of risk. But what was behind the walls of these 100-year-old buildings? So I had the privilege, I guess it was a privilege, of seeing some of them and going into some of those buildings. It was a scary experience about whether they were going to collapse on top of you or not. But this was a different kind of thing. And that learning that is now being looked at by other provinces and other municipalities about how they can apply P3 in the context of both rehabilitation and social housing. Right? Iqaluit Airport down the list, right? That just reached financial close. So that was the refurbishment of the airport in Iqaluit. That is the major transportation link of getting to the north, right? Could you do a P3 in such a remote location? Who was going to come and bid? Would people do it? What about the risks of winter construction? What? Like lots of new and different kinds of things. We always ask ourselves these questions in the preliminary phase, but we are constantly reminded that you give the private sector an opportunity, and they will figure out how to innovate and deliver it. And we had, 8 great teams come at the request for qualification stage. show up to deliver on that opportunity, and financial close was reached about 4 weeks ago. So the first one in northern Canada. So the fund is bringing learnings. It's bringing learnings to new people. It's bringing learnings about how to do projects in different ways. And so that it all comes back to that theme of expertise. You know, expertise internally, but expertise for other people. Unfortunately, in this business, there's no other way of gaining expertise than real-life practical examples. And so that's a bit about what the fund is. Maybe just one other one. There's, the Saskatoon Civic Operations Center. 5 years ago, P3s were not on the radar screen in Saskatchewan. I can tell you that they're on the radar screen now, right? The province has announced 2 hospitals as a P3. They're considering a major road project. The city of Saskatoon is already undertaking one. Those that are following the P3 news, Regina is voting today about a wastewater treatment plant. So, and we worked hard with Saskatchewan, with both the municipalities and with the new organization SAS Builds, and a great example of bringing a new jurisdiction, who is the fastest growing jurisdiction in the country with significant infrastructure needs, into the business of doing P3s. Next slide. Coquitlam, right? Again, new and different. So they're building the Evergreen line. Those of you who may not, like me, have too much information in your head about infrastructure projects in the country. The Evergreen line is an extension of a line in Vancouver to serve Burnaby and Coquitlam, I think. And they were going to do this, but there was going to be no station in downtown Coquitlam. And so this is a model which we worked on, not a large project, but to add another station to the Evergreen line. What's unusual about this? And this situation is, almost a P4, right? The private sector is building it, the public sector is contracting for it, but the private sector, a different private sector, is also helping to pay for it. So this station is going to be near the land owned and shopping mall owned by Morgard. So they're paying 40% of the cost of building this station. So, in tight fiscal times, not only do you need the discipline of the private sector to deliver the project, but here's an example of the private sector. Almost the first example that I've been able to find, because public infrastructure has significant spin-off benefits to it, to the surrounding land and surrounding economic activity. But how do you capture that to actually provide infrastructure that Canadians need? So, different types of examples of different types of things. Next slide. I've talked about the Iqaluit Airport already. If you think this is a fancy airport that we're building, this is a difficult place to do construction. Next slide. There's a bit of information on our Round 5 applications. A couple of things to draw to your attention. Still significant focus on municipalities, right? That blue slice in the top right-hand corner. Getting municipalities in the business of doing P3s has been something that has been an important priority for us. And if you take a look at the kind of applications, public transit is showing up as a new sector. Public transit is the hot topic. Those of you who drove here on Queen Street today will see in practical reality that P3s for public transit are happening right across the country. Water and wastewater and solid waste management. Next slide. Le marché canadien des PPP. On voit beaucoup de changements. Le marché a été basé sur un marché qui était dominé par l'Ontario puis le Colombie-Britannique. C'est les deux marchés les plus gros pendant les dernières 10 ans. On voit beaucoup maintenant l'introduction des nouvelles juridictions. On a parlé déjà des municipalités. On a fait au moins des PPP, plus qu'une douzaine de municipalités. Et comme on a vu, on voit un intérêt qui accroît parmi des municipalités. Mais aussi, c'était un marché qui a été basé dans le secteur de santé, secteur de justice, puis moins dans le transport. Puis on voit une diversification des secteurs. Alors, on voit une diversification de juridictions, des nouvelles provinces comme le Saskatchewan, des municipalités, et moi, j'ai heureux de dire aussi le fédéral, qui ajoute leur pipeline de projets à celle de l'Ontario, puis le Colombie-Britannique et aussi Alberta, mais aussi une diversification du secteur. Alors, c'est un marché d'une perspective internationale. C'est le plus grand marché dans un contexte d'un pays de 35 millions de personnes du monde, avec des gouvernements à chaque palier qui font des projets en mode PPP. Et on voit aussi un agrandissement de connaissances. Un agrandissement de connaissances parmi le secteur public. On a parlé beaucoup de les réseaux, le partage de connaissances qu'on fait avec les autres juridictions. Mais on voit un agrandissement de connaissances parmi le secteur privé. L'industrie canadienne est une industrie concurrentielle. On met de l'accent sur la concurrence dans des PPP, mais ça a créé une industrie qui maintenant cherche des opportunités ailleurs, aux États-Unis, en Amérique du Sud. C'est une connaissance qu'on est en train d'exporter d'une façon globale. C'est une histoire que des Canadiens ne savent pas. Alors, c'est une très bonne histoire que avec la concurrence, des fermes canadiennes peuvent réussir dans une échelle globale. J'ai mentionné déjà que le gouvernement fédéral met l'accent sur les PPP. Ils ont ajouté une autre exigence dans ce budget 2013. Et cette exigence, c'est pas juste le fonds P3 qui va faire un focus sur les P3, mais pour tous les fonds, pour tout Chantier Canada, chaque projet au-dessus de 100 millions devrait être examiné pour la viabilité en mode P3. Alors, c'est le pouvoir ou l'influence du fédéral dans le marché canadien des PPP va agrandir dans les prochaines 5 ans. Prochaine acétate. J'ai déjà mentionné que Canada est devenu un chef de file. Notre focus, PPP Canada, est domestique. Mais on reçoit des demandes de l'Afrique, de l'Amérique du Sud, pour comment même les pays européens, et surtout des pays européens qui ont commencé avec PFI, qui ont des difficultés, comment le Canada, comment vous avez réussi dans ce marché? C'est quoi ton secret de succès? Alors, ils viennent nous voir souvent pour vraiment comprendre les ingrédients de notre succès dans le marché PPP. So what are our priorities? We are always in the business of building our expertise. I think this is the first job I've had that after 5 years I'm just beginning to realize what I don't know, right? This is a business that is always changing. Right? If you went and look back at sort of capital market structures 5 years ago, and the structure of PPP transactions are completely different than they are now. or opportunities to sort of release private sector innovation, or you're into new sectors or to new models, and we will constantly be in the business of building our expertise. Federal government, we want to continue in our business of identifying and developing, but our big priority for this year is getting in the business of procuring federal P3 projects. We will never be the contracting authority for those, but we want people to have access to our expertise as they are not just thinking about a project, but actually doing a project. And that'll be a major shift for us. We have been working with other levels of government. This is the 5th year of our 5-year original $1.2 billion, and we are committed to get that fully committed to projects by the end of this year through round 5. We are optimistic about that. We need to get ready for the new $1.2 billion. We are very fortunate that the government has, in budget 2013, has given us another 5-year fund. They've asked us to focus in particular on inexperienced jurisdictions, and so how do we continue to bring new jurisdictions into the game of P3s? How do we get people that have done them in one sector to do them in other places? I mean, inexperience means, not only have you done a P3, but have you done it in that sector, and how recently have you done it? So, we'll have to think through how we help build experience with provinces and municipalities. And this new requirement that we will be very involved in, and not only looking at the application of our own fund and the investment of our own fund, but providing the best advice we can to Infrastructure Canada in the execution of their projects. Next, already gone to the next slide. Someone's keeping up with me. I mentioned that Canada is a global leader. I just want to highlight why I think that's the case, right? Because I have the great good fortune of meeting with a lot of my international counterparts, and I hear about their P3 programs, and I kind of go, oh, yeah, we're different. So what is about the Canadian example is sort of lessons that others are looking at, right? Focus on value for money, right? I mean, that sounds trite, but it's not. I mean, we are in the business. It's not P3s for ideological reasons. It's not P3s for off-budget financing reasons. It's P3s because they deliver value for money. And that is critical to maintaining sort of why do you do it? You do it because it delivers better results. And you've got to have that focus. Too many times in too many other places, and I would even argue maybe even 20 years ago in Canada, off-budget financing is not the reason for P3s. It's about better value. And right across this country, that is the driver for P3s. We talked about public sector institutions. We're unique in the world in the fact that we've built institutions to house this expertise so that there can be a good public sector counterparty and that these transactions can be well executed. Not only well executed in terms of quality at the end of the day, but in predictability and timeliness. We have the most predictable and timely procurement process, P3 procurement process in the world, right? People forget that these transactions require an enormous investment by the private sector. Why is that? When you're bidding on these transactions as a private sector party, you actually, as part of your bid, have to do significant design work. Millions of dollars of design work. You have to arrange financing. Pursuit costs for these transactions are in the millions of dollars. And if you're going to ask the private sector to on-spec, because they get, yes, there are honorarium, but pay a fraction of those costs back. But if you're going to ask the private sector to invest millions of dollars in the pursuit of a bid, it doesn't take them very long if you kind of go halfway through, oh, well, we were just kidding, or no, we're not going to take it to realization. For them to kind of go, no, well, actually, next time I'm not going to put my millions of dollars in. So a predictable and timely market, which is why we've been able to attract the very best international companies to this market, who have partnered with Canadian companies, who have shared their expertise, that have made Canadian companies stronger at the end of the day. Canadian capital markets, right? We used to complain about Canadian banks not taking risk, We don't complain about that anymore after the financial crisis. The reality of that is that required, Canadian banks didn't mismatch their liabilities. They didn't lend long-term to P3 transactions, which created a project bond market in Canada that is unique in the world. Well, pretty unique in the world. It certainly is the strongest P3 project bond market, whereas the Europeans, who almost exclusively relied on bank long-term finance for their P3 transactions, which doesn't exist post-financial crisis and is not coming back, with Basel III. We have a capital market that will provide finance for these transactions at very competitive rates, right? Long-term finance in Nunavut closed at 185. 185 over Canada. So, that is a spread that is sort of almost pre-financial crisis type spreads. So we have managed through the financial crisis, been able to close projects and provide very cost-effective financing. Competition. We are an open market. All right? Sometimes that's been to complaints of Canadian industry that you will allow competition. Well, competition delivers the best result, but competition has also brought the best expertise. And that best expertise has allowed Canadian companies to partner and become more expert in the process. So, we all kind of know in theory that closed markets don't create global champions, but this is actual case study in reality where an open market has actually created a stronger Canadian industry and simultaneously delivered the best results for taxpayers. Not a lot of markets in other countries are as open to competition as ours. And we're continuously learning and adapting. Right? People like to point to, well, there was this project 20 years ago that didn't quite deliver the results we were expecting. Yeah, we're not doing projects the way that we did them 20 years ago. We're continuously improving and adapting. Juste pour finir aujourd'hui, j'aimerais faire 2 points. Un point, c'est vraiment un travail en équipe. On est très chanceux d'avoir des employés dédiés à vraiment livrer la valeur ajoutée aux contribuables. Il y a plusieurs qui sont ici aujourd'hui, alors merci à vous tous et notre conseil d'administration. Et j'aimerais aussi remercier des personnes qui ont organisé cet événement. C'est pas un événement qui s'organise facilement. Alors, toute l'équipe de Carole et toute l'équipe de Christy et des autres qui ont fait beaucoup de travail en organiser aujourd'hui, un grand merci. Merci beaucoup.
Merci John, merci Tony pour vos présentations. Juste avant qu'on passe à la période de questions, j'aimerais vous rappeler que les présentations sont disponibles sur notre website et ainsi que dans vos trousses d'informations. Également, il y a un formulaire pour évaluer la session et on apprécierait beaucoup recevoir vos commentaires. So there is an evaluation form in your information kit, and it's always very useful for us to get feedback from our guests to just do better next year. So let's start with the question period, and just let me know who you are and to whom you would like to address your question, and use the microphones for the translation. Could you use the microphone for the purposes of... Thank you.
A merchant banker of 44 years. I was living in London, England for 23 years. I consider myself a pioneer of the PPP Canada, that is the private-public initiative. I was involved as team
PP3 being a government agency is a total departure from where the instrument started as a private sector initiative. The same thing like BOT. But it seems like somehow the process gets to be hijacked by certain interested group or big companies, engineering, and so on and so forth. And that's what happened to BOT. Now, the one problem that I also have is with the experience of BBB or BBI, all the projects that I was involved in. And one of them I can mention because I'm under confidentiality agreements. One of them is Jarvis PLC. When we started with Jarvis, it was bidding for 400 schools in England. Now, the share value of Jarvis was 17p. When the announcement was made, the share value of Jarvis jumped to £7. And Jarvis went on to become from a 32 million pound capitalization to over 1.4 billion and then bankrupt. We were also involved as a team with Northern Ireland, the government. And all these projects there also failed. The problem is, how do you mitigate, first address and mitigate the risk? Now, risk is spread over 25 years. We are a bunch of people sitting around, and each one with a piece of pizza in his mouth and a bottle of beer, and trying to articulate what would be the cost of maintenance, for example, of this bridge in the year 2050. Your guess is as good as mine, and that is the risk. Now, where do we take this process, I think, is something else for the future. I am one of those people who would not recommend it as a professional. There are many other financial instruments that the government can use without using our tax dollar. They can use their guarantees, they can use their approval, they can facilitate a lot of things that will make the process more accountable and, in the long term, more deliverable. Thank you.
Not sure what the question was. No, it's okay. It's okay. I guess I'd respond in a couple of ways. The first thing, that these are contractual arrangements to deliver public infrastructure, right? The role of they're not private sector-led initiatives because the public sector needs to decide what projects it needs and how it wants to pay for them. And it is the party on the other side of the contract. So I'm not sure about your experiences, but these things are about how best to deliver public infrastructure that governments have concluded that they want to build. Right? So the role of the public sector has to be in the driver's seat on deciding what public infrastructure needs to get built and how it gets funded. The question that we have is how best to deliver them. Right? This is not about the private sector coming up with ideas for public infrastructure that the public sector doesn't want or doesn't need. So there needs to be that on the other side of the on the counterparty. The other thing I say is, how do you know what things are going to be like in 25 years, and how do you know about these kinds of things? Well, that is the discipline of private sector capital at risk, right? People make these judgments, and they don't get paid, and their capital doesn't get returned. And that's why it applies only in certain types of transactions. We talked about large and risky, but also applies best in circumstances where the performance specifications are stable over time. So, what is it going to cost to repair a bridge in 25 years? Well, it's going to cost, that depends on how it was designed how it was constructed, how it was maintained over that period, and how it was operated. And all of those things are integrated into one contract that the private sector is responsible for. And all of those things are backstopped by significant private sector capital at risk if they don't deliver, and very clear performance specifications. So that it's not at year 25 that you go and you take a look at the bridge and kind of go, oh, by the way, is it in a good state of repair? There are very clear sort of mechanisms right along the way with very clear independent engineering studies to see whether or not those things are delivered. So those things are contemplated, and I can tell you that the private sector is better at figuring out what it's going to cost to maintain that bridge in 25 years when they had to design, build it, and operate it than the public sector ever would be if it was doing none of those kinds of things. You're right that the proof will be in the pudding, but there are lots of examples where this is working out. This is working out well.
We have a question over here.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, this lady here.
I think she was first.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Jordana Feist, Canadian Union of Public Employees, National Research Department. The central justification for P3s is that they deliver value for money. It's on the basis of these complex and manipulable calculations that P3s are approved. Yet it's the exception, not the rule, that these value for money statements are released to the public. The consequence is that taxpayers and local decision makers are left in the dark with no opportunity for independent scrutiny and review. Why are the value for money statements or value for money assessments not made public?
Well, I can say that all of the projects that we fund, issuing a public value for money report is a requirement of our investment. So all of the projects we're investing will issue public value for money statements, reports, public value for money reports, and do.
Okay, over here.
On this side?
Thank you. My name is Michael Teeter. I'm with Forum Equity here. I'm in Ottawa. Our company, you know them, is in Toronto. A few more questions and comments, and I think they're mostly to Mr. McBride. You mentioned, I was going to ask you this anyways, that PPP Canada will not be a contract authority for federal projects, and I was wondering whether it was under consideration. Now I can, I guess, conclude it was, because right now you just have one federal organization, Defence Construction Canada, with some kind of expertise in contracting for these P3 projects. And so I guess if the answer is you're not going to do it, who is? Or maybe you could enlighten us there a little bit. I also want to say a comment is that I was here last year, and I think maybe the year before as well, but you guys are making tremendous progress. I think that in the federal world, I'm hearing a lot more about your involvement with contracting and all the good work you're doing. So I think you deserve a pat on the back. There's not a lot that a lot of times you can say in 1 year an organization has actually made an impact inside a bureaucracy as massive as the federal government, and I think you're doing a great job. The one thing that happens with D&D and now with Shared Services Canada, they're being quite transparent on they've always been D&D on their capital requirements, on their projects that are upcoming, the dates and so on, which has the effect of allowing the private sector to plan their own programs around these capital requirements, which is a major task for us to plan our deal flow, to allocate resources and so on. I was just wondering if there's been any discussion in your world about trying to be transparent like that with projects, so that again the private sector gets some sense of what's coming down the pipe and so on. I think it's a great thing with D&D. I think Shared Services is starting to do a great job now with their vendor community, and I think it might help if in the P3 space we started to do that a little bit. And the last thing I would say is maybe a question too, is that I'm finding, we were talking about being an open market in our contracting, and we are. Perhaps one of the most open in the world, but what I'm finding now increasingly is that the security requirements are getting in the way of that, so perhaps you might want to comment on that.
Sure. Probably should have the pen for all the questions. Thank you. When I mentioned sort of contracting authority, I mean other options are open, but I should be clear about what I meant by that. There are two things in sort of managing a procurement. I mean, who signs the contract at the end of the day, right? Who is actually the signer of the contract, and who is actually advising and managing the procurement process. So you're familiar with, for example, Partnerships BC transactions. Partnerships BC is not the contracting authority. You're involved in the social housing. Well, you're the leader of the social housing transaction. So that social housing transaction in British Columbia is actually a transaction with BC Social Housing. Your contract is with BC Social Housing. But it's not like you didn't see Partnerships BC in that process. Right? So if you kind of, the easy answer is, I think the best model, I mean, although there are all alternatives, I mean, the Infrastructure Ontario model is that they are actually the contracting authority. The BC model is the line ministry is the contracting authority, but Partnerships BC provides support and advice to that ministry through the procurement process. It's more that model that I see applicable in the federal context, but doesn't mean that other models aren't. But I see that as the more appropriate model for the federal context. So it's not like you wouldn't see us on a transaction in the same way you see Partnerships BC on the transactions that you do in BC. On the second point, I completely agree. No, thank you for the compliment. It's a lot of people are doing a lot of work, and I'm particularly pleased that you're noting the increased dialogue among our federal colleagues and partners on, and you highlighted some of the people that we're working with. So thank you for that. Remind me of your third.
The deal flow.
Transparency on the deal flow. We'd like to, and we do that in terms of market soundings and part of our business cases on that. All I can say is there is a constraint on sort of the ministerial decision-making process. Nobody gives transparency on a project until such time as, and I can never see us, how do you reconcile ministerial decision-making processes with decision to go forward with the realities of trying to give people sort of a heads up. But D&D is doing it. I mean, if you gave me your list of the things that are sort of major P3 projects that you think are happening at the federal level, you probably have a fairly good insight into what they are, right? You mentioned a couple of them already.
His last question, John, was about the open market and some of the security issues.
Yeah, no, and people have talked about that as a constraint. I mean, the security question on steroids was the CSEC example of recently, and that is the most secret facility probably that the government of Canada has, and it did require a process for security checks and the rest of that kind of stuff. But interestingly enough, and everyone said, oh, well, it can't be done, and you can't manage security in the context of a P3. But guess what? People figured it out, and I think if you went and you talked to, I think PCL is here somewhere, asked about their experience in doing that. It had its issues, but it was definitely doable. So maybe you might want to comment on that, because that's probably the most difficult security situation we'd likely have in the federal government. I'm not sure whether you'd want to share your experience with people.
Do you mind using the mic just for the translation? Thank you.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
David Rossetti, PCL Construction. It is a prolonged process, but it is a doable process. It starts at a very early stage, And I think each company that gets involved in the contracting process goes through an application process that could take up to 4 to 6 months, but there was an accelerated process adopted by the program. So it worked. Shortened that, months into like a month.
Okay.
So
good.
It was workable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next question, Lisa Mitchell, the Director of Strategy and Policy, has been monitoring the questions coming online. So is the question coming from online? Lisa?
Yeah, we have a couple of them. The first one would be, how do you respond to the criticism of P3s that big risks cannot be effectively transferred to the private partner because the public sector will always bail out a failed public project?
What's a failed public project, right? That is why capital is at risk, right? If private sector takes on risk and for some reason can't deliver, where does that leave the public sector? I mean, it's true to the extent that you're building a hospital, you still need the hospital, but when they walk away from that project, they walk away with their money on the table. So what have you lost, right? People also confuse situations. Is it, the ultimate sort of risk for the private sector is that they go bankrupt in delivering the project, right? But if they go bankrupt, let's work through a couple of scenarios. They go bankrupt in construction, the public sector has paid them zero, right? It's all of their money at risk, and we take over that facility based on what the cost is to complete the facility, and if there is shortfalls, that shortfalls for equity and ultimately debt holders in the transaction. That's how it works, right? If it happens in operations, same kind of things happen. I mean, that is the discipline of capital. Can things go bad? Possibly. That's not been the experience in the Canadian context. Partly because not only is the public sector doing due diligence, but the people whose money is at risk are doing due diligence and monitoring it along the way.
Thank you. Do you have another question?
I have quite a few, actually.
Okay.
The second question would be, what accounting standards guide the financial reporting of federal P3s? To what extent does the federal government disclose details of federal P3s in the public accounts of Canada? Are the long-term financing obligations in relation to federal P3s presented in the Government of Canada consolidated financial statements? And does PPP Canada provide any guidance to federal departments on financial reporting in relation to P3s?
Yes, yes, and yes. They are recorded as assets and liabilities. The full financial obligations are in the CSEC building, for example, will show as an asset on the books of Canada, and the obligations will show as a liability. We follow sort of conservative practices in that regard, to make it clear that we're not doing it to sort of for off-book accounting. And yes, we provide advice. Greg, our CFO, was at the audit committee of the CSEC a month ago, talking about exactly that and our experience and our advice on how to deal with that and deal with the Treasury Board and sort of public accounts people on that. I'm not sure, Greg, whether there's anything you'd want to add to that.
Do you want to go again?
With the infrastructure challenges facing Canadian municipalities, and knowing that the vast majority of municipalities are medium and small sized, and they are responsible for 80% of all the projects happening in Canada, what is the best way for these smaller projects, under 50 million, to be part of a P3? It seems that P3 Canada is only for the very large projects, of which most across Canada are not.
The government announced in Budget 2013 $55 billion over 10 years for, I think that's the right number, $55 billion over 10 years for public infrastructure, through gas tax, through provincial territorial infrastructure, through their national infrastructures, right? And through the P3 Canada Fund. So the P3 Canada Fund is $1.2 billion out of $55 billion, right? So, you got to put that in context of the federal government's overall support for infrastructure projects across the country. However, I would say, and people are looking at this already, I think there's opportunities for smaller projects to be bundled. I mean, I think smaller municipalities are looking at that already. To have, for example, we've looked at projects, I mean, they're challenging to put together, but mostly for governance reasons. You know, a single wastewater treatment plant serving, 3 municipalities, to bundle them into larger sizes, not only will that allow for greater efficiency of delivery, but allows for sort of P3 opportunities. I would also sort of say when we're talking P3, we're talking, there are different models of P3, right? So what's appropriate for a full design, build, finance, operate, maintain model with long-term finance is different than what's appropriate for other variations of the model. So we have demonstrated for smaller transactions like we have in Lac-La-Biche, and does anyone know what the population of Lac-La-Biche is? It can't be more than a few thousand people, all right? 3,000 people who did a wastewater treatment plant under, more of a design, build, operate, maintain model where with less long-term finance. So you can bring the disciplines and the thought processes of a P3 to smaller transactions, but you need to tailor them to the nature of the smaller transactions.
The next question is, a crucial part of the value for money proposition is appropriate management of the project agreement during the implementation and operational periods. Has PPP Canada considered the need to develop and foster appropriate expertise in the management of P3 contracts post-closing?
Yes. I think that's right. Not only do P3s talk about a different public sector skill in the identification, development, and execution of P3 transactions, but they require a different type of skill in the management of those contracts. I'd say, first of all, we're realizing that there's value for us through the whole life cycle of a P3, and so when we're going to be a source of expertise, and as we mature as an organization, we have certainly developed expertise around identifying potential projects, developing, and we're now focusing on executing P3 projects. But we see that as a role in terms of providing expertise through the operations phase. I would also say that we work closely with other P3 agencies in the country. This is an issue for provinces as well, and so there has been dialogue about, is there a curriculum, a training program for people who are in the business of managing P3 contracts?
Good. In the interest of time, and I don't want to cut anything short, but we'll take one more question. Do you have one more question?
I have a few more.
So what we'll do is we'll take one more question online, and for those who were not able to address because of the interest of time, on the chart you can see the contact numbers that we've got, and I would suggest that you submit those questions, and we'll be only too happy to respond to your questions. So we'll take one more.
One additional question. PPP Canada has been strangely quiet as respects to the referendum and related misinformation making its way throughout Regina. Would PPP Canada not have been better served to respond and educate Regina citizens for their benefit on behalf of other municipal clients considering use of the P3 model for their next infrastructure project?
Well, we've been there with Regina through this transaction. I've been in Regina. We're speaking about this at the infrastructure, the Regina Infrastructure Conference. Minister Flaherty has put an editorial. But having said all of that, this is a decision for the citizens of Regina. Right? We have made it clear that we think it's a great transaction. We think it will provide value for money. We've been very open about that. We have supported the City of Regina in their analysis. We have provided an objective review of that. But the mayor and the City Council of Regina, I think, are fully capable of talking about their transaction and have done an excellent job in explaining to the citizens the value that it brings. And the same way that we've been very clear about why we think it's something that warrants a $58 million investment. But that's a debate that the citizens of the City of Regina need to have and vote on today.
Thank you very much. Just in closing, it occurred to me as we were talking about this is that, like a lot of organizations that I'm familiar with, we tend to fall into acronym city. And at no point in time did we mention that PPP means public-private partnership. And so it's very much, and that's to the point of the question on Regina, I think specifically, which is it's not as though P3 Canada or any of the private sector participants are kind of taking over these projects. It's very much a partnership, and the municipal, federal, and provincial governments are in the driver's seat with respect to them requiring the public infrastructure to be built and managing that process. We're there to facilitate it and help it, and that's the way that works. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning. You've been very attentive, and that's appreciated. Merci à tous.